there's quite a lot of discussions that are taking place about SDG and the role of education in the SDG, etc. I would like to highlight only one dimension, that I like to call as durable inequalities that are created by the educational system. When the wealth system creates inequalities, educational system creates durable inequalities. How durable inequalities go against the principles of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, So in other words, the question that can be posed is that how do we create a learning generation? This is the title of one of the reports by Gordon Brown. I'm borrowing it from that. How do we generate a learning generation? And how do we implement the idea of progressive universalism to reduce the elements of durable inequality? That is what I wanted to share in the next 10 minutes with you. First, when we talk about SDG, it's a shared responsibility for human destiny. And I think this common destiny is defined in terms of three dimensions, which are very important from the point of view of education also. One is inclusion, which in the presentation, it was shown that leaving no one behind. The second one is integration, the interlinkages between different targets that are put, or different targets that are put, 17 targets of SDG. What are the interlinkages between the two? Because in many cases, you find that education plays and not only an important role, a intermediary role in facilitating some of these dimensions. And the third one is especially one related to universality. And it is very important, this third one, because we are talking about an agenda where we are talking about universal principles, universal values, universal standards, and based on human rights, and that are applicable to all countries in all circumstances, at all times. So it is very important. Why I'm making this point is also because that something that is not internalized in the SDGs, when the SDGs were formulated in the mid-decade of the 2010s, it is also a stage marked by increase or rise in nationalism in many countries. If I can use the term, a new authoritarian nationalism is coming up in a big way, and it is affecting multilateral cooperation, which is one of the essential tenets of SDGs achievement, achievement for SDG goals, and it is very important. So you find that these issues, therefore, in the 1980s and 1990s, we were talking about globalization and glorification of markets. But today that stage is over, especially from the 2007 crisis period onwards. And what a new phase that is coming into in the elections in many countries also is an feeling of nationalism and against multilateralism and against common good for the world, etc. So therefore, my first feeling is that the first fight to achieve SDG in the new transformed situation is that the fight for democracy and human right to achieve SDG, and where all sectors like education also plays an important role. And let me also make a brief comment on the international agencies, which are always intending to promote the international globe or global citizens, etc. And if you look at the international donor community, it has failed to reach the 0.7% of the GDP as a contribution for aid. And you will find that the deficit is around the 38 countries forming, the 29 donor countries forming this group. The deficit is around $170 billion in AIDS, So we are not getting the expected responses from the donor community. In 2000, the Dakar framework of analysis was implicated that any country with a realistic plan will not suffer its implementation because of lack of resources. But we have gone a long distance, or we had distanced ourselves substantially from such indications. Now, when we come to, of course, we have made certain progressions. I am not denying that. But when you talk about the question of education, just two dimensions that I would like to highlight. One dimension that I would like to highlight is the inequalities in the current period. The second one is, which is more important, is its capacity education. If educational opportunities are not distributed equally, its capacity to accentuate, aggravate intergenerational inequalities. Because one quality with education is that you cannot inherit it. Unlike the private property, unlike the landed property or wealth and money of your parents, you cannot inherit it. You have to acquire it. So therefore, unless you create conditions or equity conditions, I will not say equal conditions, equity conditions to acquire it as much as you can or as much as you should, these inequalities will go on increasing mostly in most of the countries. That is why I wanted to call it as the type of durable inequalities that can be perpetuated by the system, perpetuated by the educational system in the absence of unequal distribution of opportunities to pursue education. I like to take up three issues, or three types of issues. One is issues or inequalities in access to education. The second one is inequalities to quality education, and third one is that inequalities in the learning outcomes. Let me focus on these three dimensions. See, what one finds is that if you look at the inequalities in access to primary education, I'll come to higher education within a minute. In primary education, what one finds is that one of the dimensions that is becoming important is that many schools are closing down. It may be I may sound a little unrealistic, but empirically it is valid that there is a decline in enrollment at the primary levels. And there is a decline in the enrollment at the upper primary levels. And many schools are closing down. So for example, the data for 2018 shows that 368 schools in Uttarakhand was closed down, and more than 4,000 schools are in the verge of closing down. So schools closed down because of two reasons. So for example, in Kerala and Karnataka, also the schools closed down. But when in Jharkhand, Orissa or Uttar Pradesh, the schools are closing down, the reasons are not the same. There is a demographic effect as a result of that non-availability of children, and therefore school numbers should come down. That is one aspect. But what is happening in many places is a combination of two effects. One, the private sector is taking away the students from the government schools, and the government schools become smaller. And as a result of that, what one finds is that a decline in the number of government schools in many places. So it's a combination of these two factors. I'm raising this issue because we have RTE, and we also have all efforts to promote universal primary education, but we are in a situation whereby the additional enrollment to primary schools are on the decline. So therefore, this is something that needs to be highlighted. If you look into higher education, again, you will find that access to higher education, thanks to the policies of reservation or quota systems, etc., have improved. There is no doubt about it. But if you see the relative inequalities in higher education, access to higher education, it has remained more or less same or similar across generations. This is very important. Even in the context of massified higher education systems, even in a situation where higher education system expanded at a very fast rate and at a fast rate of growth in this century, what one finds is that the inequalities, some of the inequalities remain very high. Say, for example, you will find that the inequalities in terms of social inequalities between scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, general categories, and OBCs, you find that these inequalities remain at a very high level. The regional inequalities have increased. It is not reduced, even with a larger number of institutions coming up. That is also one of the reason is also because of the role of the market, because 78% of the institutions and 66% of the enrollments in higher education in India are in the private sector. And you'll find that many of the private sector institutions are concentrated. It creates an urban-rural divide in the one sense, and it creates concentration of institutions in certain specified states and localities. And a result of that, it creates inequalities and widening of inequalities. A third form in which the inequalities are widening is that of inequalities based on the income levels. If you analyze the NSS data based on the income, the first quintile and the highest quintile and the lowest quintile, what one finds is that the differences in higher education enrollment among the people belonging to the lowest 20% of the population income level has widened substantially, and that is one of the most pronounced inequalities in access to higher education in the country. So I was focusing on access to education, some of the initiatives that are taken which had a positive effect, but still then inequalities are widening. So the question that is to be posed at this juncture is that what are the strategies, what are the measures in place, both at the primary school level and at the higher education level, to circumvent, to overcome these difficulties and inequalities. A second dimension I also want to highlight is that the interstate variations in enrollment are increasing. What is important is that if you look at the transition rate from primary to upper primary or from upper primary to secondary education, while the gross enrollment ratios at the primary level is almost getting universalized, the inequalities are declining. But when you go to the successive levels of upper primary education and secondary and higher secondary education, we find that these inequalities are widening. And you will find that these inequalities are widening. Also, what is important to notice is that it is in the educational inequalities are larger. Yes, I'll take 2 more minutes. The educational inequalities are larger or wider in educationally backward states. That gives me a lot of concerns, a lot of problems for attainment of SDGs. So these inequalities in access. The second one dimension that I would like to highlight is that the differences today are not between those who are in the schools and those who are outside the schools, or those who are in the higher education institutions and outside the higher education institutions. Today, the inequalities are wider and widening within the schools and within the higher education institutions. I would like to say that, somebody mentioned about the learning crisis. The global learning crisis is a reality. And I will add that the cumulative learning deficit that you develop in the schools is one of the important reasons for aggravating the global learning crisis. And you find that at the primary level, even at the upper primary level and secondary level, a trend that we find is that this learning crisis is widening, and therefore going to school is a legitimacy for a democracy. You get going to sending children to the school as a legitimacy for democracy, a legitimacy for equality of opportunities. But in fact, we are making them very different from those people who are going to quality institutions and who are having quality education. So the distance between these two groups are widening. And this is more important today at the school level and higher education level, because larger share of the students are already in the schools. A larger community who are eligible for higher education are already in the colleges and the universities. The third dimension that I would like to highlight is that outcomes, schooling outcomes. What happens to those who are coming out of the secondary schools or higher education? And if you look at the employment pattern and unemployment pattern, you find this very clearly. Because what we find in India is that employment organized sector is declining systematically. And what we find is that only 92% of the employment is either in the informal sector or in the non-formal sector. The formal sector employment is only 8%. And that is one part. The second part is that even the employment and the job in the organized sector is getting informalized. And that has a lot of implication for the well-being or even of those people who are employed. And if you look into the educational pattern and the employment, you certainly find that educated unemployment is also increasing. We are in a stage, what we used to call as zero growth in employment or jobless growth. I think recent studies have indicated 2019 and 20 that we have crossed that stage. We are in a stage of job loss growth, not jobless growth, job loss growth, and how its implications will be reflected in terms of distribution among the different segments and how education will be playing a contributory role. Let me end by making two statements. I think one of the important dimensions that we have to see is that how do we improve the image of public institutions? That is the place where we play important role for SDGs. If you are talking about the progressive universalism as a principle to be implemented to achieve SDG goals, then it is very important to see that the schools and institutions where the poor are going should be given priority in terms of improvement. And how do we translate that into an operational practice? Unfortunately, even when public investment or public efforts in some of the select states is going to government schools, public confidence in the public institutions are declining. And therefore, I will feel and I will argue that not only public investment, but also we need to emphasize on regaining public confidence in public education. Thank you.